Hey folks, welcome back to the Mac and Mike Show. I'm Mac, he's Mike. Never the twain shall meet. It's been a good day today. We had a lot of time to sit in the back porch and talk about things. And as normal, we talked about 101 different subjects. And we always say, oh, we should talk about that on the podcast. Oh, we should talk about that on the podcast. But I told Mike before we got together today, what I'd like to talk about a little bit is the 60 Minutes interview with Kamala Harris. And I think the impact of 60 Minutes interview with Kamala Harris is much larger and broader than even the average observer may be able to evoke from that thing. And to set the stage for you, what happened was there's been a ton of criticism about Democratic presidential nominee and candidate Kamala Harris because she's not doing any interviews. So about a week ago, she started on this blitz of doing all these interviews, and she did an interview on The View, and she did an interview with shock jock
Howard Stern.
Howard Stern. She did a couple of minor podcasts. She also did an interview with 60 Minutes. Now I'm from the age of when you're how do you know you're having a bad day? Mike Wallace is at your front door,
Yeah.
right? So I mean it's 60 Minutes is a serious news organization, and they've been a serious news organization for a long time. They maybe lean one way or the other on certain issues, but you could pretty much always figure on getting hard hitting questions from 60 Minutes. So they did this interview, and they teased the interview a little bit on a couple of days before the 60 Minute show actually aired. And they did this one particular question of Kamala Harris, and she gave this answer that was somewhat disappointing, if not nonsensical. And it was a long, rather, and she oftentimes gets criticized for using what they call a word salad. She says a lot of words that don't necessarily have any bearing on the question that was asked, or even any impact or any connection to the question that was asked. So she gets that criticism a lot. So what happened was the pre-release version of the question and answer, when it came time for the actual question and answer on the broadcast of 60 Minutes, they replaced her answer with a completely different answer. The answer was short and concise, and maybe wasn't anywhere more clear than what she answered before, but it was a very crisp and very short, very direct, and very concise answer. And it made her seem much more as a serious candidate than the answer to the first question. What that opens up to me is this idea of being able to trust your nightly news. 60 Minutes has always been compared to one of those hard news organizations that they would pretty much give you the straight skinny, no embellishment. As for those of you that are old enough to remember this, Dragnet, Sergeant Joe Friday, just the facts, ma'am. So 60 Minutes had that reputation. But this complete replacement of an answer to a question, opens up for interpretation whether or not 60, in my mind, whether or not 60 Minutes can be trusted anymore. We live in a world where we're always on the watch with this new AI stuff and Mike, we've got deep fakes, we've got fake language, where people do a CGI or an AI generated picture, and then they put words in the mouth of the AI generated figure that the real original person never said. And there's so many variations of that. And we're always, the old statement used to be, believe, nothing of what you hear and only 50% of what you see. And I think now the admonition should be, trust but verify. Double check everything. Don't
Yeah.
believe anything that you see or hear.
Agreed.
And so, where do you come down on 60 Minutes and their complete replacement of one answer for an incoherent one? Does that make you question CBS? Does it make you question news? Does it only one other layer on top of all the other layers that we have to ferret through to get the real truth?
Well, for a long time, I have not trusted the media in general, even before Trump. And again, I know this is probably very repetitive. I go back to my career in the Air Force, and it was a propaganda unit. And even though I was not directly involved with propaganda, I got to understand what it was all about. And then I had this one experience that I've told you about. I don't know if I've ever mentioned it. There was a movie came out years ago called Behind Enemy Lines. And the local NBC affiliate came in to do an interview, and I was selected out of my shop to do this interview and show them what it was really like to be trapped behind enemy lines and how we instructed our students to be recovered from that, because that was my career field. And they asked me a series of questions both in my shop and then out in the woods. And when I saw the edited version, which was really only 2 or 3 minutes on the news, they're with you for 2 hours
Mm-hmm.
and they're recording all of this. And then they go to the editing booth, and the question they asked me was not the answer that I gave in real life, but was one that I had given earlier, and they used the voiceover. So, because you couldn't see my mouth moving, it was like put in. Now, that did not change the substance at all. And it wasn't done for political purposes. So I think there are times where they do edit for substance and not political purposes, maybe to cut the
For
time.
clarity or timeliness, yeah, sure.
But because of the situation and because we had such a contrast with Kamala Harris they put all these side by side videos up there, as you know, of what she originally said and what they edited to say, that it makes you very suspicious. And not only that, they come in and they clarified, and who was the man that was doing the interview?
Bill Martin, I think.
Bill Martin. They used his voice to explain what Kamala Harris's answer was later.
Well, that was another question, another answer. While she was answering another question, Bill Martin's voiceover says, what Kamala Harris is saying is that this, and this, and really she didn't say any of that.
Right.
But they needed to help her out so that they could boost the understanding of what they thought the Democratic Party stood for.
So, but in final analysis, I don't ever trust anything I see or hear. I always try and get multiple sources on anything that is questionable. And I take what I can't verify because there may be no other sources to check. I take it with a grain of salt.
You know, they did this to Trump on the Charlottesville thing, you know, where he said, I'm sure there are fine people on both sides. He was talking about one group of people. And like 2 sentences later, he says, now this doesn't apply to the neo-Nazis who are saying all these crazy, hateful things. He said, I don't believe, you know, I'm not supporting them at all, but they don't play that part of the sentence. So it's one thing to manipulate the scene or to manipulate the words to cut it off short, whatever. So it carries across a inference or a meaning that the original didn't intend. That's one form of misrepresentation. But I think it's slightly different when you take an answer and use that answer to answer a question that, I mean, the answer and the question are completely unrelated. Mm-hmm. Now, in your case, you know, it didn't change the substance of of what you were trying to get across, and it wasn't a specific instance. It really was more or less a generalization, communications of this is how we instruct our people. This is the kinds of things that they do. But this was a direct question to her about a policy matter important to the United States of America, and she absolutely, I mean, she failed completely. So they put an answer in there that made her seem much more presidential. And I think, you know, in these days where we talk about, you know, Russian collusion and election interference and all these kind of things, doesn't that put CBS on the same level of election interference of you know, like when Facebook wouldn't let the story, the New York Post story about the Hunter Biden laptop be published on Facebook? That was withholding of information rather than a lying or misrepresentation. But isn't that what this whole argument of mal, and disinformation about? I mean, if they're putting out information to the general public over the airwaves as a hard news organization, aren't they held to a certain standard of truth? Now, there's the old joke about, oh, I believe this. Why do you believe that? Well, I read it on the internet,
Hmm.
right? I mean, you can put anything on the internet today. You can't trust anything on the internet because you don't know the source. You don't know there's and you, Mike. I mean, you go crazy looking for all the notations and the references and the attributions and those kinds of things before you'll repeat something. But not everybody does, and I think that in the day of this fake kind of news that's being spit about all the time, and the pointing out of when people are misrepresenting, telling half truths, or taking things out of context, all of those are legitimate claims and legitimate accusations. But the question I have is, at what point in time does someone who is supposed to be a hard news organization, at what point in time is their obligation to deliver what's real? Um, you know what I remember? You probably don't. It wasn't a big deal to a lot of people, but I served in Operation Desert Storm, and I know you too. CNN had a news bureau office in Baghdad, and
Baghdad Bob.
they knowingly published propaganda from the Saddam Hussein government,
Hmm.
and they put it out there as being a fact. And it was several things. It wasn't just one thing.
Right.
And after the war was over, they were called on the carpet and said, "Hey, you delivered as facts these falsehoods about the situation, about the weapons, all these different things." And they said, "Well, we were the only news organization in Baghdad, and we felt it was more important for us to be here with access to this rather than." So yeah, we published that stuff even though we knew it was untrue.
And they had minders there and Baghdad. Remember Baghdad Bob?
But Baghdad Bob, yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, that was a big boogaboo after it was all over. And of course, it all did come out that they that was their justification, is better to have us there spewing their propaganda than to not have us there at all, because when the war is over, we could come out and tell the truth. And
Well, but you see, that's what they said.
that's what they said.
What I believe is that they were interested in their ratings. They were the only news organization in Baghdad. They were getting the highest ratings. Everybody was watching the news every night for the latest and greatest. I think it was all about ratings. So that kind of leads you to the point where you say, can I trust any news organization? But extenuating circumstances, we don't know. They could have been shot if they said the wrong thing. I mean, that's possible too. And people do stupid things when they're threatened to that level. But that leads you to question their integrity. But when CBS News, in the form of 60 Minutes, absolutely switches answers, they absolutely took an answer to a different question, and which was that question was never aired, and put that as the answer for her answering that first question we talked about. That is an absolute misrepresentation. That's not the candidate lying. It's not the news organization, trying to save their lives or reporting things because, of their unique situation. That was CBS without any threat. I don't know what word I'm searching.
Pressure.
Without any pressure,
Yeah.
they 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 took it upon themselves to make the Democratic president for candidate look more capable than she obviously was.
Yeah.
And I think that CBS News, in the form of 60 Minutes and their entire news organization, needs to admit what they did and then give us reasonable justification for what they did. I mean, from my perspective right now, the only thing I can say is that CBS wants to get um, Kamala Harris elected president. So they tried to make her look good. Well, isn't that the same thing that they put Donald Trump through 9 months of impeachment trials because, quote, Russian collusion to influence the election? You
Yeah.
know, one could argue that the Russian dossier, put together by former MI6 agent Steele, was the greater attempt to influence the election than what the Russians did. But so I don't know if anybody else is incensed about this ploy that 60 Minutes used to put Kamala Harris, presidential candidate, in a better light. But I think that I'll digress for just a moment. You know, when we did our Constitution, right? We had the Articles of Agreement. They weren't working real well, so the government said, "Look, let's come up with a different form. Let's come up with another way to do this." So they sent a bunch of people to the convention, constitutional convention. They had representatives from every state, and they came up with the Constitution of the United States. And the states, the colonies, the states, the new states, were a little bit concerned about the lack of individual protection, right? The protections didn't seem to be there. So what the government said in the Federalist Papers and lots of other different ways is, look, we need this new constitution. We'll put these new rules in place, but don't worry, we will give individual protection and we will amend the Constitution. So what they did is they passed the Constitution, the number of states needed passed it, and then they came up with the Bill of Rights. And I'm sorry I got off on that left-hand turn, but what the Bill of Rights did is guaranteed certain protections for individuals, and one of the protections was freedom of the press. And the reason why freedom of the press was included in the First Amendment was that the whole revolution, in no small part, was built upon the news of the day that kind of ramped up, you know, support that the tea tax, the all the different unfair taxations without representation kind of thing. And the newspapers, the press of the day supported these kinds of protests. This is wrong. This is wrong to treat people this way. And what they said was, we're Englishmen, we're entitled to the same, representation that our Englishmen in England are, and we're not getting that. So, they came up with the Bill of Rights, and in the First Amendment was protection for freedom of the press. And the reason why freedom of the press was thought to be so important is because the revolution was in many ways supported by the freedom of the press. So we have laws that protect news organizations from lots of liability in a lot of different ways. And we also give them great latitude in being able to present information because, again, it is a constitutionally protected right. However, what is the penalty or what is the punishment if that right of freedom of the press is abused? Because it's one thing when you do a voiceover and you say what Kamala Harris is trying to say is this, and you massage the information a little bit so it's more coherent. But it's another thing entirely when you ask a question, she gives an answer to the question that's completely incoherent. So they take another statement from another part of the interview and completely replace the first answer. It's putting words in her mouth that she may have said, but were not said in response to that question. And therein becomes fraud. And it does become election interference, in my opinion. You're entitled to your opinion, Mike, you're entitled to your opinion. But my point is that we have protections for freedom of the press because we held, or we do hold, these organizations such a high standard of telling the truth. Well, what do we do when they don't tell the truth? Is there any punishment or any kind of what ramification is there for blatantly, falsely misrepresenting what the candidate said and feeding that to millions of people across the airwaves? Should there be punishment or some sort of retribution for that activity? What do you think, Mike?
Well, I think it boils down to the only ramification is loss of credibility, which that's why I research things so meticulously because even if you, I know I'm extra when it comes to this, but to get one thing wrong and to have to sit there and retract it or make amends and correct it is an embarrassment. And of course, the more times this happens, the more you lose credibility. Now, you and I, unlike a lot of people in our audience, maybe, are in our 60s and we go way back. And young folks, you have to understand, back in the day when Mac and I were your age, in our teens and 20s, There were three major networks: ABC, NBC, CBS. PBS hadn't even come out. There was no cable television. I keep saying this, we had a half an hour of news, world news in the evening, a half an hour of local news, and that happened at 6 and 11 for your 2 o'clock late hours. You might have a little news in the morning, and you had your Sunday talk shows. So there wasn't a lot of time to fill. And the radio or the TV stations and the radio stations that carried news, they were always making their money off of advertising dollars, and it keeps going back to follow the money. So as time went on, we ended up with cable television. Then CNN had CNN 24-hour news. Then they had CNN headline news, and then you got Fox and MSNBC and all these other competitors in the business. And what they were doing is, first, now you've gone from only having to fill 2 hours a day for news to having to fill 24 hours a day. You're only competing with three people. Now you're competing with, when cable came out, 4, 5, 6. Then the internet comes and you're dealing with another dimension. And then you're dealing with all the other specialized newspapers that are now online and also doing video on their online news presence. Mm-hmm. Everybody is competing for your eyeballs and your ears. And so what that does is it skews things. It's so messed up today. There's too much information. I wish we could go back to just the 1 hour at 6 and 11
that'll never happen
for news. And no, that will never happen. But I really think that is when everything started to fall apart. And people could take the time to be political. Another thing that I've always said, you can accuse Fox of the same thing, or OANN of being conservative and promoting the conservative candidate over MSNBC and the others. But what I wanted to say there is, whether you're watching MSNBC or Fox or anything, unless you're watching like at the 6 o'clock hour, you have Brett Baer. He's fairly standard hard news guy. The same thing at 11 with Trace Gallagher. And I don't know who's on the other networks, but they do interject opinion now into those. And those hours used to be simply news, period. 1 hour, straight news, no commentary. I think one of the solutions that they should voluntarily do is have a little chyron down in the corner of the screen that says hard news, and as soon as the guy moves to commentary, put it opinion or commentary down at the bottom. And that could be all in the same segment. Here's the facts. Now I'm going to explain my opinion on it. And I think that would just settle a lot if networks would just do this voluntarily. We should all call for it as citizens, in my opinion.
I don't disagree with your solution, Mike. I guess what I'm trying to really kind of put my foot down on is this example of misrepresentation. I would actually call it, I mean, it's an absolute lie. It's a misrepresentation of the individual it's really two huge facets. One, she wasn't ready to answer the question or answered it inappropriately. And two, they fixed it up for her to make her look better than she was, both of which lead you to, there's different questions about the candidate based on what they did. And I think there should be a reckoning. There should be an apology and probably a fine. There has to be some document signed. This will never happen again. I mean, the difference from broadcast news, Mike, when you read something on the internet, there's no rules on the internet, okay? It's, what's that, caveat emptor, let the buyer beware?
Yeah.
But the over-the-air broadcast news, there are licenses granted by the FCC for those people to basically have a near monopoly for that broadcast signal. Not that they're a complete monopoly, because as you noted, there's at least 3, maybe as many as 7 different kinds of places to get your news. But the over-the-air broadcasts are regulated and governed, and there's rules and regulations by the FCC. And to me, to allow CBS to get get away with what they've done. See, if the FCC does nothing, then how are they going to be able to enforce the realities of truth in future instances? And let me throw another curveball at you. Imagine if that was the interviewer doing an interview with Donald Trump, and he said something that was almost incendiary, and then they replaced it with words that were much less so, and made him look, maybe his first comment made him look like some sort of ism, racism, misogynism,
Sexism.
sexism, all those different kinds of isms they want to throw at him. But maybe the first answer was close to that, and they replaced it with a much more vanilla, or a non. I mean, would the left-leaning people of object the objectively, would they be sitting by idle saying, oh, well, that's
Oh
okay,
no,
they
they'd be
just,
screaming about it.
and what would they want done? They would, whatever news organization did it, they want to take them off the air. There, I've heard Tim Walz and Kamala Harris both say free speech is one thing, but we can't have people putting out there mal, and disinformation. Well, what do they mean by that? I mean, how are you going to limit? How are you going to? Who gets to set the rules for what free speech is and isn't? Who gets to set the rules of what truth is and isn't? Because I'm going to tell you something: the left-leaning opinions and the right-leaning opinions are diametrically opposed. You're not going to get any agreement as a compromise as to what the truth is out of those two different sides. So who gets to set the rules? Well, maybe it's whoever's in power. Really? So if there's a Democratic administration, the truth is one thing. If there's a Republican administration, the truth is something else. That can't be right. There has to be an absolutely objective truth. So we have to come up with some way of, and maybe it ultimately comes down to each individual. Each individual has to decide what they want to consume and what they don't want to consume. But Mike, I'm telling you, there is something wrong if CBS gets away with doing what they did, because it is every bit the influencing of the election as much as they want to claim the Russians did in 2016.
That's also an in-kind donation.
Yes.
It's FEC, Federal Elections Commission
And
violation.
I'm not sure the news organization is allowed to give donations to a political candidate.
No, in some countries, like I said, there was all these people that came in to interview me for Vets for Trump early on in the 2016-17 timeframe. And one of the Asian markets, I can't remember which one, they actually set it up so that each candidate, depending on whether they're running for dog catcher, mayor, or governor, or president of the country, is given a certain amount of money from the taxpayer. And the television stations are required to give fair and equal access to everyone.
Mm-hmm.
So if you got 10 commercials and you're running for the same office, the opponent, they get 10 commercials. If you get a half hour time, they get a half hour time. And, that seems to be more fair, and it's limited so that, how many billions of dollars, we'll get sidetracked on that. How many billions now are we putting into presidential elections?
Big business.
It's
really
yeah,
big
just
business.
follow the money, man. It's all about the money. So I won't go any further into that.
Well, I think also, Mike, that, and we heard this earlier today, I think, in one of the television talk shows, there's been a change in the participation, the affiliation of the Democrat and Republican Party.
Mm-hmm.
50 years ago, the Republican Party used to be the party of organized business, big business, lawyers, and white collar workers, and there used to be the Better Business Bureau, or the Chamber of Commerce.
Chamber of Commerce.
I mean, all of these business people used to be Republicans, and the thought was that Republicans would implement policies that were good for business. The opposite of the Democratic Party, the Democratic Party was viewed as being the party of the working man, right?
Yeah.
The blue collar worker, the unions, the average Joe, the people that were the middle class and maybe below, that were fighting for that were fighting for their place in the economy. So I think that over time, and I'm not sure that Donald Trump was the one that made this change in the party affiliation, But today you can see, Hollywood is massively behind the Democratic Party. The legal profession massively behind the Democratic Party because they want to be able to sue everybody, right? I mean, how do lawyers make money? They sue
Should be
somebody,
appealing.
right? And that whole legal lobby that looks for the easy money in tort. The Republican Party wants a tort reform, the Democratic Party doesn't. And there was no place really for the working man in the Democratic Party. I remember when Hillary Clinton was running against Donald Trump in the 2016 election, and they went to West Virginia, and they were in one of these coal mining um, union offices, and there were 3 or 4 coal miners there. They were all going to vote for Trump, and I'm watching. And it's like on ABC or something. It was ABC or CBS. It was not one of these conservative, and they're trying to get him to say that the announcer is saying, "We're going to vote for Hillary Clinton, right?" No, I'm voting for Donald Trump, and there was a shift when the Democratic Party started caring about men competing in women's sports, and they started caring about LGBTQ TIA activists more than, and when they started caring all of these DEI hires are, diversity is our strength.
And
When the
going
Demo-
easy on criminals.
Go easy on when the Democratic Party started thinking more about those constituencies than the blue collar worker constituencies, the blue collar workers were kind of left in the cold.
Mhm.
There was nobody there representing them, and the big businesses. It's interesting to me that you know Elon Musk has been one of the big stories of this election. He's been an early and strong supporter of Donald Trump, and as we both know, and as our followers know, he bought Twitter, turned it into X, and his justification for overspending on Twitter by order of magnitude was that this is the new public square. And there has to be someone there who's enabling and allowing people to have discourse on both sides so that both sides can be heard. Because there's so many stories about all these Instagram and Facebook and all these other platforms that are hiding information from one side of the equation. And they're really, they what do? They throttle you and they shadow ban your stuff. And there's all kinds of new terminology in our lexicon today for what goes on in these. So I really believe that Elon Musk is a free speech and freedom loving American, and I think that he's not fighting for Donald Trump, but rather he's fighting for the principles, the things he
Yeah,
believes in.
it's about
And I
policy.
and I think it's the same thing with these traditional blue collar workers. There was Donald Trump just spoke to the Detroit Economic Club, and Donald Trump looked this Ford manufacturing guy in the eye and says, "Look, if you shut down the factories in Detroit and you move these factories to
Mexico.
Mexico, I will slap a tariff of 35% on every car that you try to bring back across the border." And he said, "Nobody will buy your cars because they'll be too expensive." Michael Moore, you can search for this on the internet. He does a 3-minute diatribe on, and Michael Moore is certainly no Republican, certainly no conservative,
Mhm.
but he does this thing about Donald Trump doing and saying that, and he said all these workers in all these Rust Belt states, they glommed onto Donald Trump because here was somebody finally fighting for their jobs, for their livelihood, for their ability to make a decent family supporting wage, and for them to earn their freedom and their spot on the economic ladder in the middle or upper middle class. And when he talks about that, he talks about it so passionately. I mean, this is Michael Moore. This is the guy that what is it, the movie he did, uh, where
I,
he followed the guy that was the head guy at General Motors, and Herbie and Me or whatever it was. It wasn't Herbie, but it was the head guy of, and he made him look like a buffoon because of what he was doing. And Michael Moore, he may be many things, but he's not a dumb man. And he read the riot act and he said, look, these people love Donald Trump, and he said he's the one fighting for them, not fighting for some inarticulate, you know, not understandable part of the government. He's fighting for them. It's a very personal thing, and they're going to vote for him. And I think that when CBS, I'm going to try to bring this back to what we started, when CBS intentionally hides the inability of Kamala Harris to answer a very simple question with a straightforward answer, I think that that rises to the level of election interference. There needs to be some punishment. There needs to be some admission by CBS and 60 Minutes of what they did and an explanation of why they did it. And let the American people decide, because that's what it's about, Mike. The American people are going to make a decision on November 5th.
Yeah.
And they need the information, truth. They need true information in order to be able to make a conscious decision. And look, they may make a decision that I like or I don't like, and that's not the issue that I'm raising. Excuse me, that I'm raising here or that I'm concerned about. I'm concerned about CBS with an FCC license and a guarantee of being able to operate by the federal government. Absolutely misrepresentation. People are getting all upset about this dis, and malinformation. And you can easily put this question and answer and the swapping out of the answer under that heading, dis, or malinformation. And I think that something has to be done, lest nothing be done and it becomes a free for all on the public airwaves.
Yep.
What do we think?
I think that about wraps it up, Mac.
Should we say Mac and Mike?
Out.
Out.